The blade pressed cold against Tessa Harlow's throat before she even understood what was happening. Her brother Marcus stood 5 feet away, in the center of their family's estate garden, his face twisted with something between rage and desperation. The silver dagger in his trembling hand caught the moonlight, and his eyes, those same green eyes she'd grown up trusting, were wild with an emotion she couldn't name. Behind him, their father watched from the stone terrace with an expression carved from disappointment and ancient tradition. "You've left me no choice," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "Father says if I don't prove myself worthy, the family seat goes to you. A woman. Do you know what that would mean for our name? For our legacy among the other hunter families?" Tessa's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd known for weeks that something was shifting in their household, that her father had been evaluating them both with increasing scrutiny. The Harlow family had been vampire hunters for 11 generations, their bloodline steeped in the ancient codes that governed those who stood between humanity and the creatures of the night. She'd trained alongside Marcus since childhood, matching him skill for skill, sometimes surpassing him. She'd never imagined it would come to this. "Marcus, please." She raised her hand slowly, her own weapons still holstered at her sides. "We don't have to do this. We're family." "Exactly." His knuckles whitened around the dagger's hilt. "Which is why you need to understand. I challenge you formally under the old laws, a duel to yield, first blood or surrender. Father will witness. The old laws." The words fell like stones into dark water. Those laws predated even their family line, stretching back to when hunters and vampires first drew the boundaries of their endless war. A formal duel, once declared and witnessed, could not be refused without forfeiting all honor and standing. It was a relic from a brutal age, almost never invoked in modern times. Almost never. "I won't fight you," Tessa said firmly, though her mind was already racing through scenarios, through the implications. If she refused, she'd be cast out, stripped of her family name and all the protections it carried. In a world where vampires walked in shadow and ancient grudges never died, that was a death sentence. But if she accepted, then you forfeit. Marcus took a step forward, and she saw the desperation more clearly now. He was terrified. Of what? She wasn't certain. Their father? The responsibility? Or perhaps of her? "Draw your blade, Tessa, or surrender everything right now and walk away." She looked past him to where their father stood, that pillar of stone and tradition who'd raised them both to be weapons against the darkness. He said nothing, did nothing. This was Marcus's test, then. His chance to prove he had the ruthlessness their world demanded. Her hand moved to the silver blade at her hip, fingers closing around the wrapped hilt that had been her mother's before her death. The weapon felt like betrayal in her palm. "Tessa Harlow." The voice cut through the garden like black silk drawn across bare skin, and every person present froze. It hadn't come from any direction, it simply existed, suddenly and completely, filling the space with an authority that made her brother's challenge seem like a child's game. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Marcus spun toward the garden's entrance, his silver dagger raised, and Tessa felt the words die in her throat as a figure stepped through the iron gate that should have been locked, should have been warded against intrusion by centuries-old protections. He was impossibly tall, well over 6 feet, and moved with the fluid grace of something that had long ago transcended human limitation. His hair fell past his shoulders in waves of pure white that seemed to drink in the moonlight, and his skin held that distinctive pallor that marked him as other, not sickly, but luminous, like alabaster carved by a master's hand. He wore a black coat that belonged to another century, perfectly tailored, speaking of wealth and power that transcended mortal understanding. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They were silver, true silver, like mercury catching light, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that stripped away every defense she'd ever built. A vampire, here, in the heart of one of the most powerful hunter families in the country. "Seize him!" her father roared, finally moving, his own blade appearing in his hand with practiced speed. The vampire didn't even glance in his direction. He simply raised one pale hand, and her father froze mid-stride, locked in place by some invisible force. Marcus tried to charge forward, but the same power caught him, holding him suspended in his attack position like an insect in amber. Then those silver eyes returned to Tessa, and she realized with cold certainty that she was the only one still free to move. "You were challenged to a duel under the old laws," the vampire said, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't quite place, something European, ancient, refined. "I invoke the right of substitution, which predates even your precious hunter codes. I will stand in your place." Tessa's mind reeled. The right of substitution was a legend, something from the oldest texts that no one took seriously anymore. It allowed a champion to fight on another's behalf in matters of honor, but it required, "You need my consent," she said, forcing the words through a throat gone dry. "And I don't even know who you are." A ghost of something that might have been amusement touched his perfect features. "I am Lucien Dracolisti, king of the Northern Covenant, and I have watched you for longer than you know, Tessa Harlow." He moved closer, each step deliberate, predatory. Marcus and her father remained frozen, conscious but immobile, witnesses to something beyond their control. "Your brother seeks to cut you down to preserve his ego. Your father allows it to maintain tradition. I find myself disinclined to permit either outcome. You're the Vampire King." The words came out as barely a whisper. Every hunter knew the name, knew the legends. The Northern Covenant was the largest and most powerful vampire clan in the hemisphere, and Lucien Dracolisti had ruled it for over 3 centuries. He was death incarnate, responsible for countless hunter deaths over the years, a figure that parents used to frighten children into obedience, and he was standing 10 feet away from her, offering to fight her battle. "Why?" she demanded, finding her spine, finding the training that had been beaten into her since she could walk. "What do you want from me?" His silver eyes held hers, and she felt the weight of immortal attention like a physical thing. "Consent first, questions after. Will you accept my substitution, or will you draw steel against your own blood?" She looked at Marcus, still frozen in his attack, face red with effort and rage and fear. She looked at her father, the man who had never shown her an ounce of affection that hadn't been earned through bruises and blood. Then she looked back at the Vampire King, who had invaded their sanctuary with such casual power that all their defenses meant nothing. This was insanity. This was breaking every rule she'd ever been taught. Vampires were the enemy, monsters who fed on human blood and played with mortal lives like toys. Accepting help from one, especially from him, would mark her as a traitor to everything her family stood for. But he was also offering her a way out of an impossible situation, and something in his eyes, something she couldn't name, made her believe he meant what he said. "I consent," she said, and felt the words reshape reality around them. Lucien smiled then, and it was beautiful and terrible. "Wise choice, little hunter." He turned to face Marcus, and with a gesture, released him from the paralysis. Her brother stumbled forward, catching himself, then looked up at the vampire with pure terror dawning across his features. "You issued a challenge under the old laws," Lucien said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on everything. "I have accepted it on her behalf. The terms remain unchanged: first blood or surrender. You may begin whenever you find the courage." Marcus looked to their father, who remained frozen, unable to speak or move. Then he looked at Tessa, betrayal and accusation in his eyes. "You brought a vampire here," he hissed. "A monster. To fight your battles." "I didn't bring anyone," Tessa said, which was true, though she felt the guilt anyway. "I didn't even know. Enough talk." Lucien moved between them, placing himself in the dueling space with absolute authority. "You wanted a fight to prove your worth, boy. I'm giving you that chance. Draw your blade or withdraw your challenge. Those are your only options." For a moment, Tessa thought Marcus might actually do it. His hand tightened on the silver dagger, his jaw set with stubborn pride. He'd trained his entire life for this, had been raised to kill vampires, taught that they were abominations to be destroyed without mercy. But training and reality were different things, and standing before an actual vampire king was apparently enough to shake even her brother's conviction. "This isn't legal," Marcus said, his voice shaking. The old laws predate your family by millennia," Lucien interrupted. "They were written when vampires and humans still negotiated as equals, before your kind decided that hunting us would be more profitable than coexistence. I know them better than your father's father's father knew them. And they are very clear substitution is permitted when consent is freely given." She consented. "Now fight or yield." The silver eyes flashed with something dangerous, and Marcus took an involuntary step backward. I yield," he whispered, and the dagger fell from his nerveless fingers to strike the ground with a sound like a breaking promise. Silence filled the garden. Even the night insects seemed to hold their breath. Then Lucien gestured again, and Tessa's father was released. The older man stumbled, caught himself on the terrace railing, and fixed Tessa with a look of such rage and disappointment that she felt it like a physical blow. "You've dishonored us all," he said, his voice cold as winter stone. "By accepting a vampire's aid, you've betrayed everything this family stands for. You are no longer my daughter. You are no longer a Harlow. Get out of my sight." The words should have hurt more. Perhaps they would later, when shock wore off. But right now, standing in a garden that had become a battlefield, with a vampire king at her side and her brother trembling with shame, All Tessa felt was a strange, light-headed sense of freedom. Father Marcus began, but the old man silenced him with a gesture. "You've proven yourself a coward," he told his son. "Yielding to a monster rather than fighting. You're as worthless as she is. Both of you, out, now. And if I see either of you on Harlow land again, I will put silver through your hearts myself." "Sir," Tessa started. But Lucien's hand touched her shoulder, light as snow, cold as winter night. "Come," he said softly. "There's nothing for you here." And because she had nowhere else to go, because her entire world had just collapsed in the space of minutes, because something in his touch felt like the only solid thing in a universe gone mad, she let him guide her toward the gate. They passed through the iron arch, past the wards that should have stopped any vampire from entering or leaving, and Tessa realized they were glowing faintly blue, still active, still functional, simply choosing not to affect him. As if the ancient protections recognized something in Lucien Draculesti that transcended their purpose, a black car waited beyond the gate, sleek and expensive, with tinted windows that reflected the moonlight like oil. A driver stood beside it, another vampire with the same distinctive white hair and pale skin, though his eyes were a darker silver than Lucien's. "My lord," the driver said, opening the rear door. "Thank you, Nikolai." Lucien gestured for Tessa to enter, and after a moment's hesitation she did. The interior was leather and luxury, the kind of wealth that her family's old money couldn't touch. Lucien slid in beside her. The door closed with an expensive click, and the car began to move with whisper-quiet precision. "Where are we going?" Tessa asked, finding her voice finally. "Somewhere safe," Lucien said. "Somewhere your father won't think to look, and where the other hunter families won't find you immediately. Other hunter families." She turned to face him, and in the close confines of the car, she was suddenly very aware of how dangerous he was, how much power coiled beneath that perfect exterior. "Why would they?" "Because news of what happened tonight will spread," he said calmly. "And most hunters are even less tolerant than your father. A Harlow accepting vampire aid, being protected by the Covenant King himself, they'll see it as either treachery or madness. Either way, you've become a target." The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in, pushing through the shock. She'd lost everything: her family, her home, her place in the only world she'd ever known, and all because her brother had been too afraid to fail, and her father too rigid to see another way. "Why did you do it?" she asked, looking at his profile as he gazed out the window. "You said you've watched me. What does that mean? Why do you care if I live or die?" Lucien was quiet for a long moment, and Tessa thought he might not answer. Then he turned to face her, and the intensity in his silver eyes made her breath catch. "6 months ago, you were on a hunt in the Ravenswood district," he said. "Do you remember?" She did. It had been a rogue vampire, one who'd been killing indiscriminately, breaking the unspoken rules that kept all-out war from erupting between hunters and the organized covens. She'd been sent to eliminate him. "You cornered him in an old warehouse," Lucien continued. "He had a human child with him, a hostage. Your father's orders were clear: eliminate the target regardless of collateral damage." Tessa's stomach tightened. She remembered the little girl, couldn't have been more than 7 years old, terrified and crying. She remembered the rogue vampire holding her as a shield, taunting her, daring her to take the shot. "You lowered your weapon," Lucien said softly. "You negotiated. You offered yourself in exchange for the child's life, even knowing your family would punish you for the deviation from orders. You walked into that vampire's grip, let him put his fangs to your throat, just to give that little girl a chance to run." "I had a backup plan," Tessa said quietly. "The silver wire in my sleeve." "I wasn't being suicidal." "No," Lucien agreed. "You were being brave and merciful. You killed him once the child was safe, but you gave him a chance to choose differently first. Do you know how rare that is? How many hunters would have simply taken the shot and accepted the child's death as unfortunate necessity?" She didn't answer because she knew the truth. Most would have. She'd been disciplined for her choice, spent a week locked in her room with only bread and water, told she'd shown weakness unbefitting a Harlow. "I was there," Lucien said, and his hand moved to his coat, pulling aside the fabric to reveal a scar on his shoulder, pale against pale skin, but unmistakably a healed wound. "That rogue had been mine, a member of my covenant who broke our laws. I came to end him myself, to prevent exactly the kind of massacre he was creating. I watched you choose mercy when you could have chosen expedience. And I thought, here is a hunter who might understand what so many of your kind refuse to see." "What's that?" Tessa whispered. "That we're not all monsters, and you're not all murderers. That somewhere in the middle of this ancient war, there might be people capable of choosing differently." The car turned onto a private road, trees pressing close on either side, and Tessa saw lights ahead, a building, massive and gothic, perched on a hillside like something from a fever dream. "This is your home?" she asked. "One of them." Lucien watched her face. "The Covenant keeps several residences. This one is closest to your family's estate, which made it convenient. It's also very well protected, and no hunter has breached its walls in over 2 centuries. The car stopped before enormous doors of dark wood reinforced with silver ironwork, and Nikolai came around to open Tessa's door. She stepped out into cool night air that smelled of pine and old stone and something else. Something that made her hunter instincts prickle with awareness: blood. Very old blood, soaked into the earth and stones over centuries. "How many people have died here?" she asked as Lucien joined her. "Many," he said, not bothering to lie. "This estate has seen war and peace, betrayal and loyalty, death and rebirth. It has stood for 600 years, and it will stand for 600 more. But no one will die here tonight, Tessa Harlow. You have my word." She wanted to believe him, which was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. Everything she'd been taught said that vampires were incapable of honor, that their words were poison, that trusting one was suicide. But he'd saved her tonight, had intervened in a matter that wasn't his concern, and now he was offering sanctuary when she had nowhere else to turn. "What do you want in return?" she asked as they walked toward the doors. "For saving me, for bringing me here. Nothing's free, especially not between our kinds." The doors opened before they reached them, swung wide by invisible hands, or perhaps by servants who moved too quickly to see. Inside was a grand entrance hall that belonged in a castle soaring ceilings, a massive chandelier dripping crystal light, walls hung with tapestries and paintings that looked genuinely ancient. "I want," Lucien said slowly, considering his words with care, "for you to rest tonight. To let yourself stop running, stop fighting, just for a few hours. Tomorrow we'll discuss what comes next. But right now, you're exhausted, you've been betrayed by your family, and you need time to process what happened. So I want nothing except for you to accept the guest room I'm offering and to sleep safely for the first time in weeks." "You know I haven't been sleeping." It wasn't a question. "Your father has been pressuring both you and your brother for months," Lucien said. "The stress shows in your face, in the way you move. You're running on fumes and fury, and that's no way to make decisions about your future." A woman appeared in the hallway, another vampire, this one with white hair braided in an elaborate crown and features that spoke of Eastern European ancestry. She wore a simple black dress that somehow looked both modern and timeless. "My lord," she said, bowing her head. "The guest quarters are prepared. Thank you, Katerina." Lucien turned to Tessa. "This is Katerina Volkov, my seneschal. She manages the household and will ensure you have everything you need. If you have questions or concerns at any time, she can help you." Katerina smiled, and it was warm, genuine in a way that surprised Tessa. "Welcome to Blackthorn Manor, Miss Harlow. Please, follow me. I'll show you to your room." Tessa glanced at Lucien, who nodded encouragement. "Go. Rest. We'll speak in the morning." Against every instinct screaming at her to stay alert, to keep her guard up, Tessa followed Katerina through the winding halls of the state. They passed other vampire servants, she assumed, though they moved with too much grace to be anything ordinary. All of them had the distinctive white hair and pale skin, but their eyes varied in shades of silver and gray, and they watched her with curiosity rather than hostility. The guest room Katerina led her to was larger than Tessa's entire bedroom back home. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, dressed in dark fabrics that looked impossibly soft. French doors opened onto a balcony overlooking manicured gardens lit by moonlight. A fireplace crackled with fresh flames, and the attached bathroom gleamed with marble and gold fixtures. "There are clothes in the wardrobe that should fit you," Katerina said. "If you need anything else, simply press the button beside the bed and someone will come. You're perfectly safe here, Miss Harlow. No one will enter without your permission." "Even him?" Tessa asked. "Even the king?" Katerina's smile turned knowing. "Especially him. Lord Lucien takes the laws of hospitality very seriously. You are a guest under his protection, which means your autonomy is absolute within these walls." After Katerina left, Tessa stood in the center of the too-perfect room and tried to figure out what she was supposed to feel. Grief for losing her family? Relief at escaping the duel? Terror at being surrounded by vampires? Confusion about why the most powerful vampire in the region had intervened on her behalf? All of it, perhaps. None of it. Her emotions felt tangled, knotted too tight to separate into individual threads. She moved to the French doors and stepped onto the balcony, letting the cool night air wash over her. From here, she could see the estate's grounds stretching into darkness, could see other buildings scattered among the trees, guest houses, maybe, or barracks for the Covenant's warriors. Lights burned in windows, suggesting life and activity even at this late hour. How many vampires lived here? How many had she walked past without realizing the danger? Except she hadn't felt in danger. That was the strangest part. Every hunter instinct she possessed should have been screaming, should have been pushing her to find a weapon and fight her way out. Instead, she felt something closer to curiosity. Wonder, even. You're doing remarkably well, all things considered. Tessa spun to find Lucien standing just inside the French doors, and her hand went automatically to her hip where her blade should have been. She'd forgotten they'd taken her weapons at the gate, so smoothly and politely that she'd barely registered it happening. I said I wouldn't enter without permission, Lucien said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. I'm still on the balcony. Technically. That's splitting hairs, and you know it, but Tessa didn't tell him to leave. I thought I was supposed to rest. You are. I simply wanted to check that you had everything you needed, and to give you this. He held out his hand, and in it was her mother's blade, still in its silver sheath. Nicolay was rather insistent that we shouldn't confiscate a lady's heirloom. Tessa took the blade carefully, her fingers brushing his for just a moment. His skin was cold. Exactly as cold as she'd expected, but somehow it didn't feel dead, just different. Thank you. May I? Lucien gestured to the balcony railing. After a moment, Tessa nodded, and he moved to stand beside her, gazing out over his domain with an expression that might have been pride or satisfaction or simple peace. Why did you really save me? Tessa asked quietly. The truth this time, because I can't believe it's just because I showed mercy to one child 6 months ago. Lucien was silent for a long time, long enough that the night insects resumed their songs and a breeze rustled through the trees below. Do you know how old I am? He asked finally. 300 years, give or take. The records aren't precise. 347, he corrected. I was turned during the height of the vampire hunter wars, when both sides committed atrocities that would make tonight's conflicts seem like playground squabbles. I've seen so much death, Tessa. So much blood spilled over ancient grudges and pride and the inability of either side to see the other as anything but monsters or prey. He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his silver eyes seemed to hold all those centuries of weight. I'm tired, he said simply. Tired of war, tired of the endless cycle of revenge and counter-revenge. I've been looking for a way to bridge the gap between our kinds, to find someone who might be willing to see past the old hatreds. When I saw you spare that rogue instead of simply executing him with his hostage, when I saw you risk yourself for a human child who meant nothing to your mission, I thought, perhaps here is someone who could understand. Someone who might be willing to try something different. Different how? Tessa asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The old laws contain provisions for peace accords, Lucien said. Ancient agreements that haven't been invoked in centuries. If a vampire and a hunter were to form a formal bond, a covenant of protection and mutual understanding, it would create legal grounds for negotiating broader treaties. It would give both sides a reason to pause, to reconsider whether this endless war is truly necessary. You want to use me, Tessa said, and was surprised to find she didn't feel angry about it. Just resigned. I want to work with you, Lucien corrected. There's a difference. I saved you tonight because you didn't deserve what your family was doing to you. But I also saved you because I believe you're uniquely positioned to help change things. If you're willing, and if I'm not, then you rest here as long as you need. I help you establish a new identity away from the hunter families, and you live your life however you choose. I won't force anything, Tessa. That would defeat the entire purpose. She studied his face, looking for the lie, for the manipulation that had to be there. But all she saw was sincerity and something that might have been hope. I need time to think, she said. Of course. Lucien stepped back toward the door. Sleep. We'll talk more when you're ready. He was gone before she could respond, moving with that inhuman speed that marked his nature. Tessa was left alone on the balcony with her mother's blade and a head full of questions that had no easy answers. She didn't sleep, not at first. Instead, she paced the beautiful room, her mind racing through everything that had happened, everything that had been said. Her family had cast her out. Her brother had tried to kill her, or at least defeat her publicly. And a vampire king had saved her for reasons that seemed both altruistic and calculated in equal measure. The smart thing would be to leave, to run, to find other hunters who might take her in, to warn them about Lucien's plans for some kind of vampire hunter accord. But the thought of returning to that life, the constant suspicion, the endless violence, the certainty that every vampire deserved death simply for existing, made something in her chest ache. What if Lucien was right? What if there was another way? Eventually, exhaustion claimed her. She collapsed onto the impossibly soft bed, still fully clothed, her mother's blade tucked under her pillow, and fell into dreams of silver eyes and white hair, and a voice that promised things she'd never dared to want. She woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of fresh coffee. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was, why her room looked wrong, why everything felt different. Then memory crashed back, and she sat up sharply, reaching for her blade. A knock sounded at the door. "Miss Harlow, are you awake?" Katerina's voice, warm and concerned. Tessa forced herself to breathe, to center herself. "Yes, come in!" The seneschal entered carrying a tray laden with breakfast eggs, toast, fresh fruit, and a carafe of coffee that smelled like heaven. "Lord Lucien thought you might be hungry. He also asked me to inform you that he'll be in his study when you're ready to speak with him. No rush, though. You're welcome to explore the estate, rest more, whatever you prefer." "It's daytime," Tessa said, accepting the tray because her stomach was suddenly reminding her she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. "I thought vampires couldn't go out in direct sunlight, yes," Katerina finished with a slight smile, "but the interior of the manor is perfectly safe for us. The windows are specially treated, and the architecture was designed centuries ago to allow us comfortable movement during daylight hours. We're not trapped in coffins, Miss Harlow. We simply prefer the night." After Katerina left, Tessa ate mechanically, her mind already moving ahead to the conversation she needed to have with Lucien. She needed answers, real ones, detailed ones about what he was proposing and what it would mean for her. She found clothes in the wardrobe as promised, modern but elegant, perfectly sized, as if someone had measured her in her sleep. It should have been creepy, but somehow just felt efficient. She dressed in simple black pants and a deep green blouse, strapped her mother's blade to her hip, and went to find the Vampire King. A young vampire, he looked barely 20, though he was probably decades or centuries older, appeared in the hallway as if summoned by thought. "Miss Harlow, I'm Dimitri. I'll escort you to Lord Lucien's study." The study turned out to be a library that would have made any scholar weep with envy. 3 stories of books climbed toward a domed ceiling painted with scenes of night skies and celestial bodies. Ladders on rails allowed access to the higher shelves, and comfortable reading nooks were scattered throughout. Lucien sat at a massive desk near the windows, sunlight falling in golden bars across ancient wood, somehow making him look even more otherworldly. He rose when Tessa entered. "Good morning. I trust you slept well?" "Well enough." She moved into the room, her eyes cataloging exits and potential weapons out of pure habit. "You wanted to talk. I wanted to answer your questions," he corrected. "But yes, please, sit." She took the chair across from his desk, and Lucien settled back into his own seat with that unnatural grace that marked all his movements. "The covenant I mentioned," he began without preamble, "is called the Blood Peace. It's an ancient treaty mechanism that hasn't been used in over 400 years. It requires a vampire of royal blood to form a formal bond with a hunter of significant lineage. The bond is both symbolic and literal. It creates a link between the two parties that makes betrayal painful for both." "What kind of link?" Tessa asked carefully. "Nothing that affects free will," Lucien assured her. "You wouldn't be controlled or compelled. But you'd be able to sense my general location and emotional state, and I would sense yours. It's a trust mechanism designed to ensure that neither party can plot against the other without warning. That sounds invasive." "It is," he admitted, which is why the blood peace was so rarely invoked even when it was still common practice. It requires genuine trust and commitment from both parties, but it also creates legal grounds for negotiation between vampire covens and hunter families. If we were bonded, other vampires would have to respect your safety, and other hunters would theoretically have to acknowledge that I'm under your protection as well." "Theoretically," Tessa repeated. "You don't sound confident." "Because I'm not," Lucien said bluntly. "Many on both sides will see it as betrayal. They'll try to kill you to break the bond, or they'll try to kill me. It's not safe, Tessa. I won't pretend it is. But it's a chance to change things, to create a precedent that might lead to broader peace." "And if it fails?" she asked. "If we form this bond and it just makes everything worse? Then at least we tried." He leaned forward, his silver eyes intense. "I've lived for 3.5 centuries watching the same cycles repeat endlessly. I'm not willing to spend the next 3.5 the same way. I want to try something different, even if it's difficult, even if it's dangerous. But I need a partner who feels the same way." Tessa sat back, processing. It was insane. It was reckless. It was exactly the kind of thing that would get her killed by her own people, while simultaneously making her a target for every vampire who didn't agree with Lucien's vision. It was also the most interesting thing anyone had ever asked her to do. "What would the bond entail exactly?" she asked. "What would I have to do?" "The ritual itself is simple," Lucien said. an exchange of blood bound by ancient words and witnessed by representatives of both sides. After that, we would need to present the bond to the major covens and hunter families, give them a chance to accept or reject the new paradigm. And then we see if anyone tries to kill us, Tessa finished dryly. Essentially, yes. He didn't smile, didn't try to make light of it. I can offer you protection, resources, the backing of the Northern Covenant, but I can't guarantee your safety. This world is too chaotic for guarantees. Why me specifically? Tessa asked. There must be other hunters who've shown mercy, who might be open to this, perhaps, Lucien said. But you're the one I watched. You're the one I've spent 6 months learning about, observing. I've seen how you think, how you fight, how you treat even your enemies with more honor than they deserve. And he hesitated, something almost vulnerable crossing his features. And I trust you, Tessa Harlow. I know that sounds impossible given how recently we met, but I do. I trust that if you agree to this, you'll see it through, that you won't betray the bond for political convenience or because things get difficult. The weight of his trust felt like a physical thing, settling onto her shoulders alongside all the other impossible decisions. I need to think about it, she said. It's a lot. Take all the time you need, Lucien said. You're safe here as long as you wish to stay. No pressure, no timeline. This is too important to rush. Tessa spent the next 3 days exploring the estate and wrestling with her decision. Katerina gave her a full tour, showing her the Covenant's training grounds where vampires practiced combat techniques that were centuries old, the blood bank where they stored donated human blood, which had surprised her. She'd assumed they hunted exclusively, the library levels dedicated to vampire and hunter history from perspectives she'd never been taught. She met other members of the Covenant, vampires from all over the world who'd come to serve under Lucien's rule. They were wary of her at first, a hunter in their midst, but Lucien had made it clear she was under his protection, and that seemed to be enough. What surprised her most was how normal they all were. Yes, they were immortal predators with strength and speed that made them apex creatures, but they laughed and argued and formed friendships and relationships. They had hobbies and interests beyond hunting humans. They were people, just different. On the evening of the 3rd day, she found Lucien in the gardens, standing beneath an ancient oak tree and gazing up at the emerging stars. I'll do it, she said without preamble. I'll form the blood peace bond with you. He turned to face her, and something that might have been relief crossed his features. You're certain? Once it's done, it can't be undone except by death. I'm certain, Tessa said, and realized she meant it. You're right, this endless war isn't sustainable. Someone has to try something different, and if that someone has to be me, well, I've got nothing left to lose anyway. You have your life, Lucien said seriously. Never underestimate the value of that, then I'll risk it for something that matters. She moved closer, close enough to see the silver flecks in his eyes that seemed to swirl like mercury. When do we do the ritual? Tomorrow night, he said. I'll send word to the other Covenant leaders and to the Hunter Council. They'll have representatives here to witness it. And then... He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingers were cool against her skin, gentle in a way that contradicted everything she'd been taught about vampires. And then we change the world, Tessa Harlow. Or we die trying? Encouraging, she said dryly, but she didn't pull away from his touch. They stood like that for a long moment, human and vampire, hunter and hunted, two people choosing to bridge a gap that had seemed unbridgeable. And Tessa felt something shift inside her chest, something that wasn't quite trust and wasn't quite attraction, but contained elements of both. This was either the bravest thing she'd ever done or the stupidest. She supposed she'd find out which soon enough. The ritual took place in a grand hall deep within the estate, a room that looked like it had been designed specifically for ceremonies of significance. The walls were carved stone, ancient and imposing, lined with torches that cast dancing shadows across elaborate tapestries depicting scenes from vampire history. At the center of the room stood a raised platform surrounded by witnesses vampires on one side, hunters on the other, all of them watching with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Tessa recognized several of the hunters, representatives from the major families who'd apparently decided this was too important to ignore. They looked at her with disgust and betrayal, but none of them had tried to stop the ceremony. The old laws protected ritual spaces, making violence here punishable by death from both sides. Lucien stood at the center of the platform, dressed in black formal attire that made him look every inch the king he was. His white hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp angles of his face, and his silver eyes found Tessa as she approached. She wore a simple white dress that Katerina had provided, symbolic of new beginnings. Her mother's blade hung at her hip, a reminder of where she'd come from and what she was risking. Tessa Harlow of the Harlow line, Lucien said formally, his voice carrying through the hall. You come here freely and of your own will to form the blood peace bond? I do, she said clearly, making sure every witness heard. And you understand that this bond, once formed, cannot be broken except by death, that it will link us in ways both symbolic and literal, creating obligations and protections that supersede the current state of war between our peoples? I understand and accept, Tessa said. Lucien drew a small silver knife from his belt, and several of the hunters tensed. But he simply drew the blade across his palm, opening a wound that welled with blood so dark it looked black in the torchlight. My blood, freely given, he said, in token of protection and trust. He held out his hand to her, and Tessa took her mother's blade, copying his action. The silver bit into her palm, sharp and clean, and her blood flowed bright red in contrast to his darkness. My blood freely given, she echoed, in token of acceptance and commitment. They clasped hands, her wounded palm pressed to his, blood mingling. As Lucien began to speak in a language Tessa didn't recognize, something ancient and flowing, probably Latin or older. Power filled the room, tangible as heat, and she felt something click into place inside her chest. A presence that wasn't hers, alien but not hostile, settling into her awareness like a second heartbeat. She could feel him. Not his thoughts, but his emotions, determination, hope, and underneath it all, a thread of fear that he was making a terrible mistake that would get her killed. The sensation was overwhelming, intimate, in a way she hadn't prepared for. She gasped, and Lucien's grip on her hand tightened. Steady, he murmured, too quiet for the witnesses to hear. It will settle in a moment. He was right. The overwhelming rush of sensation faded to a dull awareness, still present but manageable. She could sense him there in her mind, a constant presence, but it wasn't intrusive. Just there. The blood peace is formed, Lucien announced, releasing her hand. Tessa Harlow stands under my protection, and I stand under hers. Any who would harm either of us must answer to both our peoples. Silence filled the hall. Then, slowly, one of the vampire witnesses, an older female with elaborately braided white hair, bowed her head in acknowledgement. The Volkov Covenant recognizes the blood peace, she said formally. One by one, other vampires added their acknowledgement, but the hunters remained silent, stone-faced, until finally one of them stepped forward. Tessa recognized him, Gerard Morrison, head of one of the most powerful hunter families on the East Coast. The Morrison family does not recognize this bond, he said coldly. Tessa Harlow is a traitor to her kind, and Lucien Draculeshti is a monster regardless of what words he speaks. This changes nothing. Several other hunters murmured agreement, and Tessa felt Lucien's surge of disappointment through the bond before he controlled it. Your lack of recognition is noted, Lucien said calmly, but the blood peace exists regardless of your acceptance. I trust you'll respect the sanctity of this ritual space enough not to start violence here. Gerard's jaw tightened, but he stepped back without another word. The ceremony was over, witnessed, and completed, even if not universally accepted. As the witnesses began to file out, Katerina approached and bowed to both of them. My lord, Miss Harlow, there are refreshments prepared in the East Wing for those willing to remain and discuss the implications of the bond. Thank you, Katerina, Lucien said. He turned to Tessa. How are you feeling? Strange, she admitted, very aware of his presence in her mind now. That constant awareness of his location and emotional state. Is it always this intense? It will fade to background noise after a few days, he assured her. But yes, at first it's overwhelming. I can feel you too, you know. Your fear and determination in equal measure. I'm not afraid, Tessa said automatically. You are, Lucien said gently, and that's reasonable. You just bound yourself to a vampire king in front of witnesses who want you dead. Fear is the rational response. Before she could reply, one of the vampire witnesses approached a male with a sharp, aristocratic face and eyes that gleamed with calculation. Lord Lucien, he said with a bow that seemed more mocking than respectful. An interesting gambit. I'm curious to see how long your little hunter survives. Casimir, Lucien said coldly, if you have concerns about the blood peace, you're welcome to voice them formally at the next Covenant Council. Oh, I have no concerns, Casimir said, his smile revealing fangs. I'm simply observing that hunters have a tendency to die young, especially those who make themselves targets. It would be such a shame if something unfortunate happened to your bonded. Tessa felt anger surge through the bond Lucien's. Not hers, but his face remained perfectly controlled. Is that a threat, Casimir? Merely an observation, my lord. Casimir's eyes slid to Tessa, assessing. Though I suppose she might last longer than I expect. She does have a certain resilience about her. He drifted away before Lucien could respond, joining a group of vampires near the exit who were clearly not happy about the night's events. Friend of yours? Tessa asked dryly. Casimir leads the Eastern Covenant, Lucien said. He's ambitious and has been challenging my leadership for decades. This bond gives him ammunition. He'll argue I've become soft, that I'm prioritizing peace with hunters over the safety of our kind. Will others agree with him? Some will. Lucien guided her toward the East Wing, where other vampires and a few hunters who'd chosen to stay were gathering, which is why we need to move quickly to demonstrate that the blood peace is about strength, not weakness. We need allies, Tessa. Both vampire and hunter, people who are tired of the endless war and willing to try something different. Over the next few hours, they worked the room together, speaking with vampires who seemed curious about the bond and the handful of hunters who'd stayed out of pragmatism rather than hostility. Tessa found herself explaining repeatedly why she'd chosen this path, defending her decision to people who saw her as either a traitor or a fool. It was exhausting, but through the bond she could feel Lucien's steady support, his pride when she handled a difficult question well, his frustration when someone was particularly obstinate. By the time the gathering wound down near dawn, Tessa was ready to collapse. Lucien walked her back to her rooms, and she was surprised to find she was grateful for his presence, for the solid reality of him beside her. You did well tonight, he said when they reached her door. I know it wasn't easy. Is it going to work? She asked bluntly. The blood piece, all of this. Or did we just make ourselves targets for nothing? I don't know, Lucien admitted. But we made a statement. We proved it's possible for hunter and vampire to choose trust over violence, and that matters regardless of what comes next. Tessa studied his face in the dim hallway light. You're scared, she said, feeling the emotion through the bond. Not for yourself. For me, yes, he said simply. You've put yourself in danger for a goal that might be impossible. That terrifies me. Then we'll just have to make it work, she said, because I didn't give up everything to fail now. Something shifted in his expression, warmth replacing the worry. No, I don't suppose you did. He reached out and took her hand, the one she'd cut during the ritual, now bandaged, and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was surprisingly gentle for a creature that could tear her apart without effort. Rest, he said softly. Tomorrow we start building the world we want to see. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity and danger. Word of the blood peace spread quickly through both vampire and hunter networks, and reactions were exactly as mixed as they'd feared. Several smaller covens reached out expressing interest in similar bonds with hunters from their territories. But just as many condemned Lucien as weak and Tessa as a traitor. 2 assassination attempts happened in the first week alone. The first was a vampire from Casimir's covenant who tried to ambush Tessa in the estate gardens. He'd underestimated how quickly Lucien could move. When he sensed Tessa's fear through the bond, the vampire king appeared, like vengeance made flesh, and broke the assassin's neck before he could land a blow. The second attempt was hunters, 3 of them, who tried to breach the estate's defenses during daylight hours when they assumed Lucien would be helpless. They'd forgotten that the interior was perfectly safe for vampires, and they found themselves facing not just Lucien but half his covenant. Tessa had been the one to talk him out of killing them, arguing that mercy would serve their cause better than more bodies. He'd let them go with a warning, but through the bond, she'd felt how much it cost him to show that restraint. They fell into a routine days spent strategizing with vampire and hunter allies who were willing to consider peace, nights spent defending against those who weren't, and through it all, the bond between them deepened from a magical link into something more personal. Tessa found herself seeking Lucien's company, even when it wasn't necessary, enjoying their conversations about history and philosophy and what kind of world they were trying to build. He was brilliant and surprisingly funny when he let his guard down, and the way he looked at her made something warm unfurl in her chest. For his part, Lucien was increasingly protective, increasingly possessive in ways that should have bothered her, but somehow didn't. When they attended meetings with other covens or hunter families, he kept her close, one hand always hovering near her back or shoulder. When she trained with the Covenant's warriors to keep her skills sharp, he watched from the shadows with silver eyes that tracked her every move. You know I can take care of myself, she told him one evening after catching him standing guard outside her room again. I know, he said, but you shouldn't have to. Not alone. I'm not alone, she pointed out. I have the entire Northern Covenant protecting me. That's not what I meant. He moved closer, and Tessa's breath caught at the intensity in his eyes. You've given up everything for this. Your family, your home, your safety. The least I can do is ensure you don't face the consequences alone. I chose this, Tessa reminded him, though her heart was beating faster now. I chose you. The bond, the blood peace, all of it. I know, he said again, and his hand came up to cup her face with surprising gentleness. And I'm terrified I'll get you killed for it. Through the bond, she could feel the truth of his fear, the depth of it. But underneath that fear was something else, something warmer and more complicated. You care about me, she said softly. Not just as your bonded partner. You actually care. Yes, Lucien admitted, more than I should. More than is wise given the circumstances. But yes, Tessa, I care about you. She should have pulled away. Should have reminded him that this was a political alliance, that personal feelings would only complicate things. But instead, she found herself leaning into his touch, closing the distance between them. I care about you too, she whispered. I think I have for a while now. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like she'd expected. His lips were cool but not unpleasant, firm and certain, and he kissed like he did everything else with complete focus and intensity. Tessa melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and felt his answering surge of desire through the bond. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than necessary, Lucien rested his forehead against hers. This is a terrible idea, he said. Probably, Tessa agreed. Does that mean we're stopping? Not a chance. The kiss changed things between them, opened a door that neither of them seemed inclined to close. They were careful to maintain professionalism in public, but in private they gravitated toward each other with increasing inevitability. Stolen moments in the library, late-night conversations on her balcony, kisses that grew deeper and more desperate as the weeks passed. Through the bond, Tessa could feel Lucien's feelings evolving from care to something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to love. And she knew he could feel the same thing happening to her. Is this part of the bond? She asked him one night as they lay together on her bed, fully clothed but tangled in each other's arms. The feelings we have for each other, is it real or just magical influence? The bond doesn't create feelings, Lucien said, running his fingers through her hair. It just makes it impossible to hide them. What we feel is real, Tessa. Inconvenient and dangerous and absolutely real. Good, she said, and kissed him again. The breaking point came 6 weeks after the ritual. Casimir made his move, challenging Lucien's leadership formally before the assembled Covenant leaders. He argued that the blood peace had made Lucien weak, that his feelings for a human hunter compromised his ability to lead, that the Northern Covenant needed a king who would put vampire interests first. The challenge had to be answered with a formal duel not to the death necessarily, but to dominance. Winner would lead the Northern Covenant and have final say over the blood peace's continuation. Don't do it, Tessa urged when Lucien told her about the challenge. There has to be another way. There isn't, Lucien said grimly. The old laws are clear. If I refuse, I forfeit leadership, and Casimir will immediately void your protection, which means you'll be killed within hours. Then let me fight him, Tessa said. I'm your bonded partner. I have the right to stand as your champion under the same laws that let you fight for me. Absolutely not. Lucien's voice was steel. He's over 500 years old, Tessa. He'd tear you apart, and he might kill you too, she shot back. At least this way we'd have a chance. If I fight as your champion and lose, you'd still be alive to continue the work we started. I'm not letting you die for me. And I'm not letting you die for me either. Tessa grabbed his arms, forcing him to look at her. This is what the blood peace means, Lucien. We protect each other. We stand together. I can do this. I've been training with your best warriors for weeks, and I know tricks that old vampire won't expect from a hunter. Let me fight for you. Through the bond, she felt his turmoil fear for her, pride in her courage, and desperate desire to keep her safe. If you lose, he started. Then I lose, she interrupted. But I'd rather die trying to protect what we've built than live knowing I hid while you fought alone. In the end, he agreed, though she felt his reluctance and terror through every moment leading up to the duel. The fight was scheduled for 3 nights later, giving both sides time to prepare and gather witnesses. Lucien spent those 3 days training with Tessa personally, teaching her vampire weaknesses that most hunters never learned, showing her how to read an opponent's intentions before they moved. And at night, they clung to each other with desperate intensity, making love with the frantic energy of people who knew their time might be short. I love you, Lucien told her the night before the duel, his silver eyes fierce in the darkness. I know we haven't known each other long, I know the circumstances are insane, but I love you, Tessa Harlow, and I need you to survive tomorrow. I love you too, she said, and felt the truth of it through the bond, resonating between them like a struck bell. and I'm going to win. For us. For everything we're trying to build. The duel took place in the same grand hall where they'd performed the blood peace ritual. But this time, the mood was different, hungry, anticipatory, like everyone expected blood and death. Casimir waited at the center of the platform, dressed in dark crimson that made his white hair seem to glow. He was taller than Lucien, broader through the shoulders, and moved with the confidence of someone who'd survived 5 centuries through strength and cunning. Tessa stepped onto the platform wearing fitted black clothing that allowed full range of movement. Her mother's blade at her hip alongside several other weapons that the Covenant's armory had provided. Silver dust, wooden stakes, iron chains, everything a hunter might need to bring down a vampire. "The human fights for you?" Casimir said to Lucien with obvious amusement. "How romantic, and how foolish." "The terms remain the same," Lucien said, his voice carrying through the hall. "To dominance or surrender. First to yield loses." "Oh, I don't think she'll surrender," Casimir said. His eyes locked on Tessa with predatory interest. "Humans rarely do. They just die." The duel began without ceremony. Casimir moved with blinding speed, and only the weeks of training with Lucien let Tessa track the motion and throw herself aside. His claws raked through the air where she'd been standing, and she rolled, coming up with silver dust in her hand and throwing it in his face. Casimir recoiled with a hiss, momentarily blinded, and Tessa pressed the advantage. Her mother's blade sang free of its sheath, and she drove it toward his chest with all the strength and precision her training had given her. He caught her wrist an inch from his heart, moving even while half blind, and slammed her backward. Tessa hit the platform hard enough to see stars, but she forced herself to keep moving, to roll away from the follow-up strike that cracked stone where her head had been. The fight became a brutal dance, Casimir's supernatural strength and speed against Tessa's training and cunning. She couldn't match him in raw power, so she didn't try. Instead, she used the environment, used her smaller size to slip under his attacks, used every dirty trick the hunters had developed over centuries of fighting creatures stronger than themselves. She got holy water in his eyes, iron chains around his ankle that burned through his skin, a wooden stake that scraped along his ribs but didn't penetrate deep enough to kill. And all the while she felt Lucien through the bond his terror, his pride, his desperate need for her to survive. Casimir was getting frustrated. She could see it. He'd expected an easy victory, expected to tear through her in minutes and humiliate Lucien in the process. Instead, she was making him work for it, making him bleed, proving that a human could stand against even ancient vampires if she had the skill and will. But frustration made him reckless. He lunged forward with fangs extended, going for her throat, and Tessa saw the opening she'd been waiting for. She dropped backward, letting his momentum carry him over her, and brought her blade up in a rising arc that caught him under the jaw. Silver bit deep into ancient flesh, and Casimir's roar of pain shook the hall. Tessa completed her roll and came up behind him, pressing the blade against the back of his neck hard enough to draw blood but not hard enough to sever his spine. "Yield," she said, breathing hard, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. "Or I'll take your head." Silence filled the hall. Casimir stood frozen, clearly calculating whether he could move faster than she could kill him. Through the bond, Tessa felt Lucien's tension like a physical thing, his readiness to intervene if Casimir made the wrong choice. "You can't hold that blade steady forever, human?" Casimir growled. "Eventually your strength will fail, maybe," Tessa agreed. "But all I need is one clean cut. Are you willing to bet your immortal life that you're faster than that?" More silence. Then, slowly, Casimir raised his hands in surrender. "I yield," he said, the words clearly costing him. Tessa withdrew her blade and stepped back, and the hall erupted in noised cheers from some, outrage from others, and beneath it all, the feeling of Lucien's overwhelming relief and pride flooding through the bond. She walked off the platform on shaking legs, and Lucien was there to catch her, pulling her against him with a grip that was almost bruising. "Never again," he said fiercely against her hair. "Never again, Tessa. Do you understand? I can't watch you risk yourself like that again." "Then don't give me reason to," she said, and felt him laugh shakily against her. The victory changed everything. Word spread quickly through both vampire and hunter networks. A human hunter had defeated a 500-year-old vampire in single combat, fighting to protect the blood peace. It was the kind of story that captured imagination, that made people reconsider their assumptions. More covens reached out expressing interest in peace negotiations. More hunters started questioning whether eternal war was really necessary. It wasn't a transformation overnight, but it was the beginning of something. Casimir, to his credit, accepted his defeat with grace once the initial humiliation faded. He swore allegiance to Lucien's continued leadership and even grudgingly admitted that the blood peace might have more merit than he'd assumed. "You fought well, Hunter," he told Tessa a week after the duel. "For a human. Perhaps there's more to your kind than I credited. High praise from someone who tried to kill me," Tessa said dryly. "I wasn't trying to kill you," Casimir corrected with a slight smile. "If I'd been trying, you'd be dead. I was trying to defeat you. There's a difference." Over the following months, the blood peace gained traction. 3 more vampire hunter bonds were formed in other territories, creating a network of protection and cooperation. Treaties were negotiated, territories established where both vampires and humans could coexist under agreed-upon rules. There was still violence, still resistance from hardliners on both sides who would rather die than compromise. But slowly, painfully, the tide was turning. Through it all, Tessa and Lucien built a life together that straddled both their worlds. She learned vampire customs and politics, became a respected voice in covenant councils. He learned human psychology and social dynamics, became better at negotiating with hunter families who saw him as the devil incarnate. And between them, the bond deepened from magical connection into genuine partnership, from political alliance into profound love. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucien asked her one night as they stood together on her balcony, their balcony now, since she'd officially moved into his quarters months ago. "Giving up your human life, your mortality, for all of this?" "I didn't give up my mortality," Tessa pointed out. "I'm still human, still aging while you stay frozen in time. About that." Lucien turned to face her, something nervous in his expression that was unusual for him. "I've been researching the blood peace bonds from history. And there's a provision I haven't mentioned." "What kind of provision?" Tessa asked carefully. "If both parties consent, the bond can be deepened, made permanent in a way that would extend your life to match mine." He was watching her face closely. "It would mean turning you, Tessa, making you vampire. It's not required. The blood peace works fine with one mortal and one immortal partner. But it's an option, if you wanted it." Tessa's heart was racing. She'd known this conversation would come eventually, had thought about it in the dark hours of the night when she watched Lucien sleep, or rather, when she watched him lie still with that perfect vampire stillness that was nothing like human rest. "Would I still be me?" she asked. "If I turned, would I still remember being human? Still care about the things I care about now?" "Yes," Lucien said firmly. "You'd be different, stronger, faster, immortal. But your core self, your memories, your values, those wouldn't change. I could make sure of it. The turning process can be controlled, refined. You'd be vampire, but you'd still be Tessa. And if I said no?" she asked softly. "If I chose to stay human, to live out my natural life and leave you behind?" Pain flashed across his features. "Through the bond. Then I'd love you for every moment we had and mourn you for centuries after. But I wouldn't force this, Tessa. Never. Your choice has to be free." She turned back to the railing, looking out over the estate that had become her home, thinking about the life they'd built together, the work they were still doing, the changes they were making. It could take decades to truly establish peace between vampires and hunters, maybe centuries, and she wanted to see it through, wanted to stand beside Lucien for all of it. "I want more time to think about it," she said finally. "But I'm not opposed. I'm just not ready yet." "Then take all the time you need," Lucien said, pulling her back against his chest, his arms wrapping around her waist. "We have all the time in the world." 2 years passed. The Blood Peace Network grew to encompass 12 vampire hunter bonds across North America and Europe. The first mixed settlement was established, a city where vampires and humans lived openly together under mutually agreed upon laws. Violence hadn't stopped entirely, but it had decreased dramatically in regions where the blood peace was recognized. Tessa celebrated her 28th birthday surrounded by both vampires and the few hunters who'd become her friends despite her controversial choices. Marcus had even reached out tentatively, apologizing for the duel and expressing interest in reconciliation. Their father remained stubbornly opposed, but she'd made peace with that loss. And through it all, her relationship with Lucien grew deeper, richer, more essential. She couldn't imagine life without him now, without the constant awareness of him through the bond, without his dry humor and fierce protectiveness, and the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his immortal existence. "I want to do it," she told him on the anniversary of their blood peace bonding. "I want you to turn me." Lucien had been reading in his study, but at her words, he set the book aside with careful precision. "You're certain?" "I'm certain," Tessa said. "I want to see this through. All the work we've started. I want to be here for all of it. And I want forever with you, Lucien. However long forever turns out to be." The joy that flooded through the bond was almost overwhelming. He crossed to her in 2 strides and pulled her into a kiss that was fierce and claiming and full of promise. "When?" he asked against her lips. "Soon," she said, "but not tonight. Tonight I want to enjoy being human one more time." They made love that night with tenderness and passion, Lucien worshipping every inch of her mortal body like it was sacred. And through the bond, Tessa felt his love for her like a living thing, vast and deep and eternal. The turning happened a week later in a private ceremony witnessed only by Katerina and Nikolai, the vampires Tessa had come to trust most. Lucien explained every step, made sure she understood the pain involved, the temporary loss of control, the adjustment period where her new vampire instincts would war with her human training. "I'll be here the entire time," he promised. "I won't leave you alone for a moment. And I'll make sure the turning is as gentle as possible." It hurt more than she'd expected, his fangs sinking into her throat, the venom flowing into her bloodstream, the sensation of her human body dying even as something new awakened. She felt herself slipping away, consciousness fading, and then Lucien's blood was on her lips. Ancient and powerful, calling her back from the edge, she drank, and the world exploded into sharp focus. Everything was brighter, clearer, more intense. She could hear heartbeats from rooms away, could smell blood and fear and desire with perfect clarity. And she was strong, unbelievably strong, her body thrumming with power she'd never imagined. When she opened her eyes silver now, like Lucien's, he was there, watching her with wonder and pride. "Hello, my love," he said softly. "Welcome to immortality." The adjustment took weeks. Learning to control her strength so she didn't break everything she touched, managing the bloodlust that demanded she feed constantly, adapting to a world that looked and sounded and smelled completely different through vampire senses. But Lucien was patient, teaching her everything she needed to know, and Katerina and Nikolai helped fill in the gaps. And through it all, the bond between her and Lucien grew even stronger, now connecting 2 immortal minds instead of 1 vampire and 1 human. "How do you feel?" he asked her a month after the turning, when she'd finally mastered the basics of vampire existence. Tessa flexed her hands, reveling in the power that coursed through her veins, then looked up at him with a grin that showed her new fangs. "I feel like I could take on the world," she said. "Good," Lucien said, pulling her close, "because that's more or less what we're doing." They continued their work, but now Tessa could stand as Lucien's equal in every way, not just his bonded partner, but his true partner, vampire and former hunter, working together to reshape the world. Her unique perspective made her invaluable in negotiations with hunters who still distrusted vampires. She understood both sides now, could speak to both the human fear of predators and the vampire desire for dignity and acceptance. More bonds were formed, more settlements established, and slowly the old war began to fade into history. 5 years after her turning, Tessa and Lucien stood together on a platform before the first joint Vampire Hunter Council, representing the Northern Covenant and the network of blood peace bonds that now spanned 3 continents. "We stand here today not as enemies," Lucien said, his hand clasped with Tessa's, "but as proof that a different path is possible, that vampires and hunters can choose cooperation over conflict, trust over fear. It hasn't been easy," Tessa continued. "We've lost people on both sides. We've faced resistance and violence and those who would rather die than change. But we've also gained something precious proof that we're all just people trying to survive in a complicated world, that none of us are simply monsters or heroes." The council voted that day to formally end the state of war that had existed for over a millennium. Not every vampire and not every hunter agreed, but enough did to make it official, to create the framework for lasting peace. As they left the council chambers, walking into a night that belonged to both vampires and the humans who'd learned to coexist with them, Lucien pulled Tessa close. "We did it," he said softly, wonder in his voice. "We actually did it. We started it," Tessa corrected. "There's still work to do. But yes, we made the impossible happen." "Thank you," Lucien said, and through the bond she felt the depth of his gratitude and love. For choosing this, for choosing me, for being brave enough to believe we could change things. "Thank you for stepping onto that field when my brother challenged me," Tessa said with a slight smile, "for seeing something in me worth saving." "I saw everything worth saving," Lucien said, and kissed her there in the street. Vampire king and former hunter, 2 people who'd bridged an impossible divide and reshaped their world in the process. They walked home together through streets where vampires and humans passed each other with wary acceptance instead of open hostility. It wasn't perfect, it would never be perfect. But it was better. It was a beginning, and they had forever to see it through. Years turned into decades. The blood peace became accepted practice. The settlements grew into thriving communities, and the old hatreds faded slowly into history. Tessa and Lucien remained at the center of it all, guiding the transformation they'd started, mediating conflicts, celebrating victories. They traveled the world, visiting the other blood peace bonds they'd helped establish, watching as vampire hunter partnerships created change in every region they touched. They saw friendships form between species that had been enemies for millennia. They saw mixed families, vampires and humans, choosing to build lives together, raising children in a world where both sides of their heritage could be honored. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't intervened that night? Tessa asked Lucien one evening as they stood in their gardens, watching the moon rise over the estate. Often, he admitted. You would have been forced to fight your brother. You might have won, but you'd have lost your family either way, and I'd have remained a king watching the same cycles of violence repeat endlessly. Instead, we got this, Tessa said, gesturing to the estate, to the life they'd built. Got each other. Got to actually change things. Instead, we got everything, Lucien agreed, pulling her into his arms. I love you, Tessa, every day for the rest of eternity. I love you too, she said, and felt the truth of it resonating through their bond, that connection that had started as magical obligation and become something far more profound. They stood together in the gardens they'd tended for years, vampire king and former hunter turned vampire queen, watching their world turn toward a future that neither of them could have imagined when they first met in a desperate garden on a night of betrayal and choice. Behind them, the estate glowed with warm light. Inside, their covenant family moved about their lives, vampires and humans and former hunters all working together, creating something new and precious from the ashes of old hatreds. No regrets? Lucien asked softly. Not a single one, Tessa said, and meant it with her whole heart. They had work ahead still, challenges to face, resistance to overcome, but they would face it all together, bonded partners and lovers, two people who'd chosen trust over fear and created a revolution from that single choice. The moon rose higher, casting silver light across the grounds, and somewhere in the distance, Tessa heard music, vampires and humans celebrating together, living the peace they'd all worked so hard to build. She tightened her grip on Lucien's hand, felt his answering squeeze, and smiled. This was home. This was family. This was the future they'd fought for and won, and it was beautiful.